Welcome, dear viewers, to Voices from Forgotten Souls, the place where buried truths rise again and the shadows of history finally speak. Today, we bring you a story that has been whispered only in fragments across generations, a story that lived in the quiet spaces of memory and traveled by word of mouth among those who survived the darkest times. It is the gripping and unpredictable journey of Cato, a young enslaved man whose rare beauty became both his blessing and his curse. His name lived in secret for many decades, spoken softly by elders who remembered the strange events that shook an entire plantation and nearly caused a bloodbath. Today, we invite you to sit with us, lean into the echoes of the past, and listen to a true thriller of jealousy, forbidden desire, betrayal, loyalty, and the bravery that many never knew existed. This is not folklore. This is not exaggerated fiction. This is a realistic tale grounded in the brutal truth of plantation life in the early Southern territories, long before the end of bondage. And now we begin. Cato was born on a warm evening in early summer, a night when the moon sat low and bright over the fields, bathing everything in a soft glow that seemed almost unnatural. The elder slaves often joked that even the moon bent down to take a closer look at the child that had just entered the world. From the very moment Cato opened his eyes, people noticed there was something extraordinary about him. His mother, Amara, was a kind and hard-working woman from a long line of respected field hands. His father was unknown, but some whispered he must have been a royal bloodline man from the lands across the ocean, because no ordinary man could father a boy with such striking features. Even as a child, Cato had a certain presence that drew people to him. His skin was a deep, rich brown, smooth and unblemished, with a glow that remained even after long hours under the sun. His eyes held a bright calmness that made many stare twice, and his hair, thick and curled, framed his face in a way that made him look like he had stepped out of a painting rather than been born in a slave cabin. But the elders knew that beauty brought danger on a plantation. Beauty did not protect. It was exposed. From the time Cato was old enough to walk, the older women in the slave quarters watched over him closely. They warned him that the world he lived in was not kind to unusual boys. They reminded him that the masters controlled everything, even things as personal as who a slave could talk to, laugh with, or love. Cato listened carefully, always respectful, always quiet. That was the first thing people noticed about him. He was not loud or boastful. For someone so handsome, he was surprisingly humble and withdrawn. He preferred silence to unnecessary words. He preferred helping older workers carry heavy water buckets to wasting time gossiping with others. He kept mostly to himself, not out of fear, but out of understanding. He knew he had to be careful. He knew eyes followed him everywhere he went. He knew even small mistakes could cost him more than others. By the time Cato turned 15, the unusual attention around him had grown. Plantation wives and daughters often found reasons to walk near the fields when Cato was working. Some pretended to inspect crops. Some carried baskets they did not need. Some simply strolled by, moving slowly as if taking in the air. But their eyes always lingered too long on Cato. Their glances were not subtle. Even the overseers noticed and whispered among themselves, though none dared speak openly about the strange tension that was beginning to grow. By 16, Cato had already turned into a young man with broad shoulders, strong arms, and a face that made even the cruelest overseer stop for a moment. His features only sharpened with age. People said he looked like he had been carved from the finest wood, shaped by a master craftsman with an eye for perfection. But the beauty that others admired weighed heavily on Cato's shoulders. He knew he was being watched. He knew danger walked close behind him. Cato worked tirelessly and avoided trouble at all cost. He tried to stay in the company of the older men or his mother whenever possible. He finished tasks quickly and moved to the next without being told. He never talked back to overseers. He avoided the plantation house entirely, even when invited to run errands. The women in the big house noticed this too. Some felt insulted by his distance and interpreted it as pride. Others found his innocence appealing and tried even harder to get close to him. That was when the dangerous rumors began forming. Quiet at first. Nothing more than murmurs among the maids. They said the master's youngest daughter, a fiery girl with restless eyes, had developed a fascination for Cato. She was around Cato's age, with a bold spirit that often got her into trouble. She was known for ignoring rules, sneaking out at night, and climbing trees despite being old enough to behave like a lady. Many said she had a stubborn heart that only wanted what it was told to avoid. And because Cato avoided her more than anyone else, her curiosity toward him grew into something much stronger. As months passed, the daughter's interest shifted from curiosity to obsession. She found reasons to leave the house whenever Cato was assigned nearby tasks. She pretended to need help moving baskets. She asked him questions that had nothing to do with work. She smiled too much and lingered too long. Cato was always polite but distant. He kept his answers short and respectful. He never looked directly into her eyes longer than necessary. He understood the danger of even a single wrong glance, but the more he avoided her, the more determined she became. Soon the other daughters began to notice their sister's strange behavior. Then the mistress of the house noticed, and instead of stopping the behavior, something unexpected happened. The women in the house, each with her own frustrations, loneliness, and hidden desires, developed their own quiet fascination with Cato. They had never seen a slave who looked like him. In their minds, he was not human. He was a forbidden statue of beauty, placed too close to resist. On plantations, emotions rarely stayed hidden for long. The enslaved people began to whisper about the strange stares coming from the house windows. They noticed how the mistress paused her chores whenever Cato passed. They noticed how the oldest daughter blushed when he greeted her. They noticed how the youngest daughter developed a habit of following him with her eyes. Cato sensed something was changing, but did not know what to do. He tried to distance himself more, but distancing himself only increased the curiosity around him. By the time he reached 22, his reputation had spread beyond the plantation. Workers from nearby estates had heard stories of the handsome slave who caused distress in the master's household. They had heard of the young ladies who found excuses to wander near him. Some came to see for themselves, pretending to borrow tools or deliver messages. They returned home speechless, confirming that the rumors had not exaggerated anything. Cato remained a virgin, though he had faced many uncomfortable moments. Some women tried to grab his arm when no one was looking. Some tried to corner him in storage rooms. Some attempted to speak boldly about things he did not wish to hear. But he remained firm. He knew that giving in would bring disaster upon him. And he was right. Every year, the danger grew, and the master, unaware of the tension building inside his home, praised Cato for his hard work and discipline. That only made things worse. Some of the field workers began to develop resentment toward him, thinking he received special treatment. They did not understand the burden he carried, but Cato never complained. He kept his face calm, his voice steady, and his heart guarded. Everything changed on one quiet morning when the sun had just begun to rise and the fields glowed gold. Cato was carrying a pail of water toward the barn when he heard footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate footsteps. When he turned, the youngest daughter stood there, breathing hard, her face flushed, her hands trembling. She told him she needed to speak with him alone. Cato froze. His instincts screamed danger. He tried to walk away, but she moved closer, blocking his path. She told him she had been watching him for years. She told him she found him more beautiful than any man she had ever seen. Her voice was sharp, filled with the desperation of someone who had convinced herself she deserved whatever she wanted. Cato told her respectfully that he could not listen to such words. He told her it was wrong. He told her it could cost both of them their lives. But the more he spoke, the angrier she became. She warned him that she would not be ignored. She threatened to accuse him of something unspeakable. She threatened to destroy his mother. She threatened to have him whipped until he could not walk. Her voice grew louder until Cato begged her to calm down, but she only grew more determined. That moment marked the beginning of the nightmare that would change Cato's life forever. The young girl's obsession reached a boiling point. Her emotions were unstable, her heart twisted by jealousy and desire. But the worst was yet to come, because when her sisters found out about her obsession, they did not react with anger. They reacted with curiosity. And when the mistress herself learned of it, she reacted with something even more dangerous, something that would eventually drag the entire household into a silent war driven by forbidden longing. And Cato, trapped in the center, had no idea how close he was to losing everything. The storm was coming. The shadows were closing in. The dangers he had tried to avoid for so many years were finally beginning to touch him. And by the time he realized how deep the trouble ran, it was already too late to turn back. His journey toward survival, betrayal, and eventual liberation was about to begin. Cato's life changed slowly at first, like a shadow stretching across a field before anyone notices it is there. The youngest daughter began appearing everywhere he went. If he was by the barn, she appeared with some excuse about needing to check the horses. If he was sent to fetch tools, she walked behind him pretending she needed something from the shed. If he was repairing fences, she stood a little too close, pretending to admire the view, though her eyes stayed fixed on him. Cato did everything possible to avoid her. He woke earlier, worked faster, and stayed around older male slaves whenever he could. But danger has a way of moving quietly and gathering strength when no one speaks about it. Soon the oldest daughter and the middle daughter noticed their sister's obsession, and instead of trying to stop her, they became curious. They began whispering among themselves, whispering about Cato's face and shoulders and quiet nature. They wondered why he never spoke unless spoken to. They wondered why he walked with a calm strength that made him stand out from the other men. Curiosity became fascination. Fascination became desire. And the household became a silent storm waiting to break. The mistress of the house was not blind. She had noticed all three of her daughters sneaking glances at Cato. She had seen how they blushed when he lifted heavy buckets or repaired the broken steps leading to the back porch. She had seen how Cato avoided their eyes and immediately lowered his head whenever he sensed her watching. The mistress had lived long enough to understand dangerous emotions. She had seen what obsession could do to a woman who felt bored, lonely, or trapped. The plantation house was a golden prison for the mistress. She felt neglected by her husband, who spent most of his days arguing with traders or traveling to neighboring counties. In her loneliness, she began to look at Cato in ways that shocked even herself. She tried to fight the growing desire, but each time, she saw him working hard under the sun, with sweat running down his arms. She felt her resistance crumble. She told herself she was only observing, because she wanted to protect her daughters. But deep down, she knew there was something darker forming inside her. Something she did not want to acknowledge. Meanwhile, Cato continued working, unaware that 4 sets of eyes were locked on him every day. He felt the strange energies around him, but did not yet know how dangerous things were becoming. He thought the women would eventually lose interest and move on, but instead, their desire deepened. The youngest daughter grew more aggressive. She tried cornering him twice, but he escaped both times by pretending he needed to urgently fetch tools. The middle daughter grew quiet and watchful, following him with her eyes like a hunter waiting for the perfect moment. The oldest daughter, who had always been the most level-headed, found herself curious in a way she could not explain. She began asking the maids about Cato, wanting to know his background, his age, and whether he had a woman in the quarters. The mistress became the most dangerous of all. She did not say anything aloud, but the look in her eyes had changed. The maids saw it first. They whispered among themselves at night that trouble was coming. They whispered that the household was acting strange in a way that made their skin crawl. They whispered that Cato needed to be careful. One evening, near sunset, the sky glowed orange and purple, and the fields shimmered like a sea of gold. Cato was carrying sacks of feed to the storeroom when the youngest daughter appeared again. Her eyes were filled with anger and desperation. She complained that he had been ignoring her. She stepped forward and grabbed his arm with a grip stronger than he expected. Cato pulled away gently and told her she must not speak to him like that. He reminded her what would happen if anyone saw them together. She stepped closer and told him she did not care. She told him she wanted him and would have him. She told him she was willing to lie to protect him if necessary. Cato begged her to leave before someone saw them, but she refused to move. Suddenly, footsteps approached, and she panicked. She pretended to faint, and Cato had to help lower her to the ground to avoid suspicion. The maid who arrived looked confused but not surprised. The maid's eyes lingered on Cato with worry. That night, she whispered to the other house servants that the girl had grown dangerously unstable, and that Cato was in the center of a threat he did not deserve. In the following days, the tension inside the big house became suffocating. The sisters argued often, though no one knew why. Their mother scolded them frequently for wandering outside without reason. The master noticed the strange atmosphere, but did not investigate. He believed his daughters were simply becoming difficult as they aged. He had no idea the source of the conflict was one of his slaves. Cato continued his routine, but he felt a growing heaviness in his chest. Something was changing. Something he could not see, but could feel, tightening around him, like a rope. The breaking point came when the youngest daughter cornered Cato once more, behind the barn during a rain shower. She was soaked, trembling, and furious. She told him she had tried being patient, but he refused to notice her. She told him she felt humiliated and angry. She threatened once again to accuse him of something terrible if he did not give her attention. Cato froze, feeling fear ripple through him like lightning. But before he could speak, the oldest daughter appeared with an umbrella. She saw the scene. She understood immediately. Her expression turned cold. She ordered her sister to return to the house. The youngest daughter stormed off in tears. The oldest daughter turned to Cato and whispered that he needed to be extremely careful. She said trouble was coming, and she did not know how much longer she could protect him. Cato thanked her quietly and walked away, his heart pounding. But the danger only grew worse, because the mistress herself had now become part of the silent storm. She felt jealous of the attention her daughters were giving Cato. She felt threatened by their obsession. She felt anger toward her husband for leaving her alone so often. And she felt something strange toward Cato that she refused to name. One evening, she ordered Cato to fix a broken shutter near her bedroom window. When he climbed the ladder, she stood below, watching him with a hunger she could not hide. Her breathing became heavy. Her eyes never left him. When Cato climbed down the ladder, her hand brushed against his arm and lingered too long. Cato felt the danger instantly. The mistress smiled softly and told him he had grown into a fine young man. The tone of her voice made his stomach twist. He bowed respectfully and stepped away, but she followed. She asked him questions that had nothing to do with work. She asked if he had a woman. She asked if anyone had ever told him he was handsome. Cato answered with as few words as possible and quickly excused himself. From that moment on, the mistress became even more unpredictable. She watched him from windows. She walked past him slowly when he worked near the house. She dismissed servants so she could be alone in places where she knew Cato would pass, and the daughters noticed. The youngest daughter began to see her mother as competition. The middle daughter noticed that the oldest sister also seemed uneasy. A quiet rivalry grew inside the house, not spoken, not acknowledged, but burning. Cato, still innocent of any wrongdoing, had become the center of a battle he never asked for. The field workers began noticing that the housewomen kept calling him for small tasks that did not require his presence. They joked at first, but soon they stopped laughing. Their jokes turned into warnings. They told him to be careful. They told him the attention from the house could ruin him. Cato nodded silently, but did not know what else to do. He could not refuse commands. He could not run away. He could only hope the storm would pass. Then one night, everything changed. A scream echoed through the big house. The entire quarters woke up. Cato was dragged from his cabin by 2 house guards and brought toward the porch. He feared he had been falsely accused. He feared the youngest daughter had finally carried out her threat. But when he arrived at the porch, he found the master standing with a furious expression and the youngest daughter crying uncontrollably. The mistress was shouting. The sisters were arguing loudly. The maids stood frozen in terror. It was chaos. But no one spoke Cato's name. Instead, they shouted at each other about secrets, lies, and jealousy. Cato realized he was not the cause of the scream. He was the cause of the war between them. The master demanded the truth, but no one gave him a clear answer. Cato stood silently, his heart racing, waiting for a disaster that had not yet fully formed. The night ended with no accusations. The master sent Cato back to the quarters, but his eyes held deep suspicion. From that moment forward, the master began watching him closely. He sensed something was wrong, but he did not know what. Cato returned to his cabin trembling. He knew his life had just entered a dangerous new stage. Something was coming. Something that would force him to choose between survival and death. The days that followed the scream filled the plantation with an invisible heat that pressed on everyone's chest and made every breath feel tight, as if the air itself carried warnings. And Cato walked through each day, knowing eyes were watching him from every corner, from the big house windows, from the shadows of the kitchen yard, from the barn doorway, and even from the fields, where workers bent low, pretending to weed, but always lifted their heads whenever he passed. And though no one said anything directly, he could sense that the storm that had been quietly building around him was now swelling beyond control, twisting its way into every conversation, every rumor, every silent glance exchanged between the women of the house, who seemed unable to hide their jealousy and secret fear of one another. And every time Cato felt their eyes on him, he felt the ground beneath his feet shift a little more, as though danger was rising from the soil itself. The youngest daughter became unpredictable, pacing around the yard with restless eyes, like a person carrying too many secrets inside her chest. And she watched Cato with a look that mixed anger with longing, as if she blamed him for feelings she could not control. And often she appeared in places she should not have been, near the laundry yard, near the horse stables, near the storage shed, always standing too close, always gripping her hands tightly, always whispering things he could not fully hear. And Cato avoided her as much as he could, because every second near her felt like stepping into a trap made of thorns. The middle daughter became colder, speaking less, watching more, her eyes sharp and calculating. A young woman who studied Cato not with admiration, but with a strange hunger that seemed to grow each time she saw her sisters acting out of jealousy. And she began finding reasons to summon him for small tasks, claiming she needed help opening a window, fixing a lantern, or carrying something inside. And each time he obeyed out of fear, he sensed her gaze lingering on him with a desire that she tried to hide, but could not fully suppress. And her silence frightened him more than the youngest daughter's temper, because quiet desire was a dangerous fire that burned without warning. The oldest daughter grew the most conflicted, torn between wanting to protect Cato and wanting to explore her own feelings toward him. And sometimes she followed him from a distance. Sometimes she scolded her sisters sharply when she caught them staring at him, and sometimes she simply stood at the back porch, looking lost, as though battling something deep inside her that neither she nor anyone else could name. And though Cato respected her for warning him earlier, even she had begun to change, her eyes softening whenever she looked at him, her cheeks turning warm, her steps slowing, as if she were resisting something she feared would break the fragile order inside the house. But the mistress was now the most dangerous of them all, because she carried not only desire, but also authority, and the combination of those two made her unpredictable. And every time Cato saw her watching him with those heavy, unreadable eyes, he felt the same fear a deer feels when a hunter stands perfectly still but keeps the bow drawn, and the mistress seemed to be losing her grip on her own emotions, sometimes treating him with unusual gentleness by offering a soft smile or praising his work in a voice too warm. Then, other times, staring at him with a sharpness that felt like a warning she herself could not speak aloud. And the maids noticed it too, whispering non-stop in the kitchen that the mistress had crossed a line in her heart. a line that should never be crossed on a plantation where any scandal involving an enslaved man was always blamed on him, never on those who desired him. The master became unsettled by the strange tension inside his home, though he did not yet understand its source, and he grew impatient and angry, shouting at servants for small mistakes, slamming doors, demanding explanations his wife and daughters refused to give. And sometimes at night, the sound of arguments drifted out of the house and down toward the quarters, carrying curses, accusations, crying, and fearful silence. And Cato lay awake listening to the noise with dread, because he understood the truth that none of them dared speak out loud, that he was the center of a storm created by the desires of people who held power over his life. And even though he had never done anything wrong, he was the one who would be punished if the truth ever surfaced. One morning, the master approached Cato in the yard with a strange expression, as if he was trying to read the truth in Cato's face. And he asked Cato a series of sharp questions that made Cato feel as though each word was a knife cutting closer to his throat, asking if Cato had been near the house often, asking if he had spoken to any of the ladies without permission, asking if anyone had called him into private rooms, and Cato kept his voice calm, answering respectfully that he only followed orders, that he never entered a room unless instructed, that he never lingered near the house unless sent there for work, and the master stared at him for a long moment before walking away with a frown that made Cato feel something terrible was slowly unfolding in the background. The tension reached a new peak when the youngest daughter confronted Cato late one afternoon behind the smokehouse, her face red with rage, her voice trembling with heartbreak and jealousy, as she accused him of ignoring her for her sisters, which made no sense but revealed how deeply her envy had twisted her thoughts. And she told him that if he continued to avoid her, she would do something that could not be undone, something that would change everything. And her words filled Cato with fear, because she spoke with the certainty of someone willing to burn the entire house down to be noticed. Cato tried to calm her, speaking gently, explaining that any closeness between them would bring disaster on both sides, that he could lose his life, that she could ruin her future. But she would not listen, insisting that she loved him, insisting that he belonged to her, insisting that she would never allow her sisters, or even her mother, to take what she believed was hers. And before she ran away in tears, she told him that if she could not have him, then no one else in the house would either. And her voice carried the kind of promise that made Cato's skin grow cold. For the next several days, the mistress watched Cato with an intensity that felt like a rope tightening around his neck, and she dismissed servants constantly, arranging work areas so that Cato would pass near her more often. And each time he did, she touched her ring or her necklace with nervous fingers, as though she were fighting the urge to speak. Yet her silence felt more dangerous than any words could be, because her eyes held a storm of desire and anger that could destroy him with a single accusation. Meanwhile, the oldest daughter became quieter, the middle daughter became crueler, and the youngest daughter became reckless, leaving the house without permission, wandering the fields alone, scribbling angry notes in her journal, whispering threats under her breath. And the maids whispered that the girl was reaching a breaking point, and that if she snapped, it would be Cato who paid the ultimate price. One night, as the moon rose high and cast long shadows across the yard, Cato felt something shift inside him, a realization that staying silent and careful would no longer protect him, because the danger had grown too large, too wild, too entangled in the emotions of people who had the power to end his life without evidence or mercy. And he understood he needed to find a way to leave, or find someone who could help him find a path out of the storm. But the plantation was a cage with locked gates, armed overseers, and watchful eyes, and Cato had no idea who he could trust or where he could run. Yet he knew one thing with painful certainty, that if he did nothing, the growing jealousy among the women would soon explode into something deadly, and he would be the first body buried under the ashes of their chaos. And as he lay awake staring at the wooden ceiling of his cabin, he whispered a silent prayer, asking for strength, wisdom, and a chance to escape the fate that was rising around him, like a shadow, ready to swallow him whole. The morning after Cato whispered his silent prayer arrived heavy, with a strange stillness that settled over the plantation like a thick fog. And though the sun rose gently over the distant tree line, nothing about the day felt gentle, because even the birds seemed quieter and the workers moved more slowly, as if they sensed that something unseen was shifting beneath the surface. And Cato stepped out of his cabin with caution in his heart, walking toward the field with the weight of a man who understood that every step he took could push him closer to safety or closer to disaster. And he noticed immediately that the master stood on the porch, staring out across the yard with a stiffness that made Cato's stomach twist, because the master's eyes were not wandering or half-focused as they usually were in the morning, but instead were fixed directly on Cato, the cold suspicion that burned into his skin. And Cato lowered his gaze respectfully, but he felt the heat of that stare, following him all the way to the edge of the field, where the overseer was waiting, with a list of tasks that seemed unusually long, as if someone wanted to keep him occupied and far away from the house. As he began working, he felt a tension humming in the air around him, the kind of tension that builds right before something snaps. And he kept glancing toward the big house, because he could not shake the feeling that eyes were tracing his every movement. The youngest daughter appeared at the upstairs window with an expression that mixed longing and fury, her fingers gripping the window frame tightly, and Cato quickly turned away, because even her gaze made him feel exposed. But a few moments later, the middle daughter stepped outside onto the porch, her eyes following Cato like a hawk watching prey, and she whispered something to her mother, who stood beside her with folded arms and a stiff jaw that signaled she was not pleased with whatever was destroying the peace inside her home. As the mistress stared at Cato, he felt another sharp twist in his chest, and he knew her internal battle was reaching a breaking point, because her eyes held a mixture of desire, jealousy, and fear. Fear of her daughters, fear of discovery, fear of losing control of her household. Cato continued working in silence, not daring to pause or look around for too long, but as the day dragged on, the tension grew thicker until even the field workers began whispering. They told him the master had woken up earlier than usual and had been questioning servants about his daughter's behavior. And though no one mentioned Cato directly, the workers warned him with quiet voices that something was brewing, something that could destroy him if he did not tread carefully. Cato thanked them softly, but inside his mind raced, trying to understand how much the master knew or suspected, and he realized with dread that if the master learned even a fraction of the truth, It would not matter whether Cato was innocent, because a slave accused of dishonoring a white household never survived long enough to defend himself. Later in the afternoon, the oldest daughter approached the fields under the pretense of bringing water to the workers, but her eyes searched for Cato immediately, and when she found him, she moved closer with a look of deep worry, and she whispered in a trembling voice that her sisters had been fighting again, arguing loudly behind closed doors, accusing each other of trying to steal Cato's attention, and the mistress herself had broken down screaming at them to stop before the master discovered what they were hiding. And the oldest daughter warned Cato that if things continued like this, the truth would spill out in a way that could not be controlled, and that the youngest daughter had begun threatening to expose everything out of jealousy, even if it meant destroying all of them. She told him he had to stay away from the house completely, unless ordered, and that if he sensed any danger, he should run and hide behind the old smokehouse until she found him. Cato nodded with gratitude, but dread hollowed his chest because he knew that any attempt to hide or escape could be seen as guilt, yet staying still meant waiting for the storm to consume him. As the sun lowered and painted the fields in long shadows, the atmosphere inside the big house erupted again, this time louder, sharper, more violent, and the sound of shouting echoed across the yard as the master's voice roared in frustration, demanding answers that no one wanted to give. Cato moved closer to the barn, trying to stay far from the chaos, but before he could reach safety, the youngest daughter burst out of the house in tears, running toward him with wild eyes, her hair undone, her dress wrinkled, and her breathing frantic as she shouted that she could not take it anymore, that the house was turning against her, that her sisters and her mother were trying to destroy her because they knew she loved him. And Cato stepped back in horror, because her voice carried across the entire yard loud enough for anyone to hear. And within seconds, the master emerged from the house with a thunderous expression, his eyes burning with the wrath of a man who had pieced together enough clues to understand that something improper had occurred under his roof. The mistress ran after him, screaming that it was not what he thought. The sisters ran behind her, shouting contradictory explanations. The maids froze like statues, unable to move or speak, and the field workers stopped working and stared in stunned silence as the master marched toward Cato with heavy steps, his fist clenched, his jaw set, and his eyes filled with a rage that promised violence. Cato stood still, his breath trapped in his throat, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears, and he knew this was the moment he had feared for years, the moment when danger finally stopped creeping in the shadows and stepped fully into the light. And he realized with terror that his life now depended on a single choice, whether to run, speak, or stay frozen. And before he could decide anything, the youngest daughter screamed that the truth was not his fault, that she had loved him first, that she had wanted him, that she had never meant to cause trouble, and her confession pierced the air like a blade. The master stopped walking for a brief second as the weight of her words struck him, and in that moment of silence, the entire plantation held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And Cato felt the world tilt beneath him, because he knew the next few seconds would determine whether he lived or died. The silence after the youngest daughter's confession felt like a heavy curtain falling over the entire plantation, a silence so thick that even the wind stopped moving, as the master slowly turned his head toward her with an expression twisted by shock, fury, and disbelief, and the mistress grabbed her chest as if her heart had been pierced, while the other daughters stared at their sister with eyes wide from terror, knowing she had said something that could never be taken back. And Cato felt his legs weaken as he stood frozen in the yard, because he knew that her desperate outburst, though meant to protect him, had just placed him directly in the path of the master's wrath. And in that suspended moment, the master took one slow step forward, then another, his gaze shifting between Cato and his daughter, as if trying to decide who he should strike first. And when his voice finally erupted, it shook the entire yard as he demanded to know what she meant, demanded to know what she had done, demanded to know how long this had been going on. And the youngest daughter crumbled to her knees, sobbing that she had loved Cato in secret, that she had wanted him, that she had tried to get close to him, and that her sisters and mother were trying to punish her for it. And her words burst open a flood of chaos as the middle daughter shouted that she was lying. The oldest daughter tried to silence them both, and the mistress screamed at her daughter to stop talking before she destroyed them all, while the master roared louder, demanding absolute truth from each of them. But none of their voices connected into anything clear, and instead swirled together into a storm of fear and accusation that made the master's face twist even darker, until he looked like a man pushed to the edge of madness. Cato's heart pounded as he stood motionless under the weight of their tangled voices, and he knew that if he spoke now, anything he said would be drowned beneath their panic. And even if he tried to explain that he had never stepped out of line, that he had never sought any attention, that he had done everything in his power to avoid danger, the master would never hear him over the sound of his daughters confessing with shaking voices feelings they should never have spoken aloud. The master suddenly lunged toward Cato with such speed that the workers gasped, and he raised his hand as though ready to strike him or drag him across the yard. But before he could touch him, the oldest daughter stepped between them with a courage that surprised everyone, and shouted that Cato had done nothing wrong, that he had never looked at them improperly, that the only people at fault were the ones inside the house who allowed desire and jealousy to poison their minds. And for a brief moment, her words froze the master. But then the mistress stepped forward, trembling, and confessed that she too had been drawn to Cato's beauty, though she insisted she had never acted on it. And the moment those words left her mouth, the world seemed to tilt, because the master's expression hardened into something cold and deadly, and he stared at his wife, as if seeing her for the first time in his life. The air itself seemed to quake as the master turned his gaze back to Cato, and his voice emerged low and full of venom as he declared that Cato had bewitched his household, that he had poisoned the minds of the women, that he had turned daughters against mother and mother against daughters. And though every word was a lie born from wounded pride and outrage, Cato knew that logic and truth held no power here, because a slave could not defend himself against the twisted interpretations of a furious master who believed his authority had been disrespected. The master grabbed a nearby tool handle, as if ready to strike Cato down where he stood, and the field workers instinctively stepped back, some turning their faces away because they could not bear to witness what seemed inevitable. But before the master could bring the tool down, the oldest daughter screamed and grabbed his arm. while at the same moment, the youngest daughter threw herself between them again, shouting that she would die before she let him hurt Cato. And the mistress cried out for order, but her voice broke beneath the weight of her own guilt, and the middle daughter stood frozen, unable to choose between fear of her father and her own shame. The master, seeing his family in chaos, felt humiliated and enraged, and he shouted that he would get rid of Cato before the sun rose again, that he would not allow a slave to bring disgrace into his home. And in that moment, Cato felt the world narrow into a single, terrifying truth, that no matter what he said or did, his life would end before dawn, unless something changed drastically. As the master stormed back into the house shouting orders, the mistress followed him pleading desperately, and the daughters chased after her, leaving Cato standing alone in the yard, surrounded by workers who looked at him with a mixture of pity and horror, because they all understood that the master's anger was not something that faded with time. It was a fire that only grew hotter until it burned everything in its path. And Cato realized with chilling clarity that he had run out of time. Behind him, the oldest daughter appeared again, her face pale and trembling, and she whispered urgently that the master was going to send for armed men before nightfall, that he intended to have Cato whipped to death or shot while claiming it was punishment for insolence. And she told him he had to leave immediately, not tomorrow, not after sunset, but now, right this moment, and that she would help him escape through the old path behind the smokehouse with the assistance of a few trusted slaves who owed her mother old debts of loyalty. Cato felt fear tighten around his throat as he realized he had no other choice, and he nodded silently, trusting her, because trust was the only path left to survival. She told him to wait until darkness settled, then meet her behind the barn, where she would bring supplies and a chance at freedom. And as she ran back toward the house, Cato stood still, feeling the ground shake under the weight of what was about to happen, knowing his life was hanging by a single thread that could snap with one wrong step, one wrong breath, one wrong word, and the only thing he could do now was pray that the night would bring escape instead of death. Night fell slowly but heavily over the plantation, as if the sky itself understood the danger approaching and wanted to give Cato every second it could before the master carried out his deadly intentions. And Cato moved through the shadows with careful steps, avoiding every patch of moonlight as he made his way behind the barn where the oldest daughter had told him to meet her, and his heart pounded so loudly that he feared someone inside the house would hear it through the walls, and every rustle of grass or creak of wood made him flinch, because he knew that if the master or the overseers found him wandering outside at this hour, they would not ask questions or hear explanations. They would drag him to the whipping post before dawn and finish him before the sun touched the horizon. And as he waited in the darkness, he felt a cold wind sweep across the yard, carrying faint voices from the big house where shouting had erupted once again. The master roaring about betrayal, the mistress sobbing that everything was a misunderstanding, and the daughters crying over each other in a tangle of guilt, jealousy, and fear. And through all of it, Cato knew that his name was being thrown like a curse from one tongue to the next, even though he had done nothing but exist in a world where beauty itself could be a death sentence. Minutes stretched like hours until finally The oldest daughter appeared from behind the storage shed, with her cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her face pale in the moonlight, and she walked to Cato quickly, while glancing over her shoulder, whispering that her father had sent a rider to fetch 2 armed men from a nearby property, and that once they arrived, he planned to have Cato chained and beaten until he either confessed or died, whichever came first. And she pressed a cloth bag into his hands, containing dried bread, jerky, and a small flask of water, telling him he had to leave now, before the men returned, because once they arrived, the chance to escape would vanish forever. She guided him behind the barn, then behind the smokehouse, moving through darkness as if she had memorized every hidden path on the plantation grounds, and she led him to an old broken fence near the edge of the woods, where 2 enslaved men waited in silence, both loyal workers who nodded solemnly when they saw Cato, because they understood the danger he was in, and they were risking their own lives to help him escape. And the oldest daughter whispered directions, telling him which path to follow through the woods, which river he needed to cross, and which run-down cabin deep in the forest would shelter him for the night. And she told him that once he reached the road beyond the woods, he must follow it north to a safe house belonging to an old woman who had once been a wet nurse for her mother, and that this woman hated the master enough to protect any slave he wanted to harm. And Cato listened carefully to every instruction, even though fear made it difficult to breathe, because he knew he could not afford to forget a single detail. The 2 enslaved men gave him a tattered coat and a hat to hide his features, and one of them whispered that the master had been drinking heavily since sundown, and had sworn that tonight would be the night he redeemed his honor, which made Cato understand that death was already marching toward him with certain steps, and that staying even 1 minute longer might seal his fate. And so, with a final nod of gratitude, he stepped toward the broken fence. But before he could slip through it, the oldest daughter grabbed his hand with trembling fingers and whispered that she was sorry for everything. Sorry for her sisters, sorry for her mother, sorry for the pressure that had trapped him, sorry for being part of a world that gave him no safe space to exist. And her voice cracked as she told him he deserved a life far away from the cruelty of this land. And Cato felt a mix of gratitude and sorrow, because she was the only one in that house who had tried to protect him, even though she too had been part of the storm that nearly killed him. He squeezed her hand gently in thanks, then turned and slipped through the broken fence, entering the woods where the darkness swallowed him whole, like a deep breath taken by the earth itself. The forest was thick with the sound of insects and the distant hoot of owls, and the path ahead was narrow and cluttered with roots that caught at his feet. But Cato forced himself forward with silent determination, knowing every step carried him farther from the master's rage and closer to a fragile hope of survival. Branches scratched his arms, briars tore at his clothes, and the cold night air bit at his skin. But he did not stop, because stopping meant being caught, and he could already imagine the sound of horses behind him, the shouts of overseers, the crack of a rifle being cocked, and the thought filled him with enough fear to keep moving, even when exhaustion tugged at his muscles. As he pushed deeper into the forest, he replayed every moment that had led him here, every gaze from the daughters, every whisper from the maids, every warning from the field workers, every desperate plea from the youngest daughter whose obsession had nearly destroyed them all. and he realized that his life had been teetering on the edge for years, long before he understood the weight of the danger that surrounded him. And escaping tonight was not just survival. It was the breaking of chains he had been forced to carry since childhood. He reached the small river the oldest daughter had mentioned and crossed it carefully, stepping on stones to avoid leaving footprints, then continued through the woods, with the moon guiding him in and out of patches of light. And at last he found the abandoned cabin, a small, crooked structure, hidden by vines and moss, that creaked when he pushed the door open. But it offered shelter and a moment to breathe. And Cato stepped inside and sank to the floor, with his back against the wall, letting out a long, trembling breath as his heart slowly settled from the frantic hammering inside his chest. For a moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes, but even in the silence, he could not fully rest, because he knew the danger was far from over, because the master was a man who did not forgive, did not forget, and did not stop until he had destroyed the thing that wounded his pride. And Cato understood that if he truly wanted freedom, he would need more than distance. He would need allies, courage, and a plan. And as he sat in the darkness of the abandoned cabin, listening to the sounds of the night, he realized that his journey had only just begun. The abandoned cabin felt cold and hollow, as Cato sat in the dark, listening to the forest breathing around him, while every creak of wood or distant howl of an animal made him tighten his grip on the bag the oldest daughter had given him, because he knew he could not stay here long, since the master would search every corner of the land once he discovered Cato was gone. And Cato forced himself to stand, even though his legs ached from running, and he stepped outside into the deep night, where the moon hung low behind drifting clouds that cast moving shadows across the forest floor. And he followed the narrow path north, just as the oldest daughter had instructed him, moving quickly through underbrush and weaving around trees while listening for the sound of horses or dogs, because he knew that the master had resources, men, and anger that would fuel the hunt, and the fear of hearing hooves behind him made him push his body harder, even when his breath came in sharp, painful gasps. Hours passed, like a long, unbroken chain, each minute stretching with the weight of danger. And as he walked, he thought about the people who had risked everything to help him escape. The two slaves who waited by the fence, the oldest daughter who defied her father, the maids who whispered warnings even when it could cost them their positions or their lives. And he felt a deep mixture of gratitude and sorrow, because he knew they would face punishment for helping him. And he promised himself silently that if he survived, he would one day return for them, or at least help others escape from the same chain of fear that had once trapped him. The forest slowly began to thin, and he could see faint moonlight illuminating the beginning of a dirt road ahead, the very road the oldest daughter had told him about. And he paused for a moment, listening carefully for any sign of patrols or riders before stepping toward it cautiously. And once he reached the road, he kept to the edge of the trees so he would not be easily seen. Walking north with long, steady strides, every sense heightened, every sound magnified in his ears, and eventually, as dawn began to break, he saw the faint outline of a small cottage tucked between two large sycamore trees, its roof slightly crooked, smoke rising faintly from the chimney, and he knew he had reached the safe house of the old woman who once cared for the mistress as a newborn. Cato approached the cottage with fear and hope blended tightly in his chest, because he did not know whether she would truly help him or turn him away. But when he knocked gently on the wooden door, the sound of shuffling feet approached, and an elderly voice demanded to know who was outside. And Cato answered softly, explaining that he had been sent by the oldest daughter, sir. And when the door opened, the old woman looked at him with eyes full of wisdom and sorrow, as though she had seen too much suffering in her lifetime. And she pulled him inside, without asking further questions, gave him water, food, and a place to sit, while she locked the door behind them, and told him he had arrived just in time, because riders had passed her home only an hour earlier, searching for a runaway slave. Cato felt terror crawl up his spine, because that meant the master had discovered his escape sooner than expected, and the hunt had already begun. And he sat listening as the old woman told him that she once served the mistress before being cast out by the master for defending an enslaved woman many years ago. And she said she had never forgiven him, so any chance to undermine him was a chance she welcomed. And Cato realized this old woman had a fire inside her, even stronger than people half her age. After allowing him to rest briefly, she prepared a small bundle of food and gave him a map drawn crudely on cloth, explaining that he needed to head deeper north, toward a cluster of free settlements, where former slaves lived under protection. And she warned him that the journey would be dangerous, with slave catchers patrolling many of the roads, but she said he had something powerful on his side, the truth that the master could not chase him forever, because the more land he covered, the more dangerous it became for the master as well. And Cato understood that his best hope was to move fast and avoid every main path while relying on the kindness of those who despised the plantation system. When he stepped outside again, the sun was rising, and the old woman whispered a blessing over him, telling him he had a rare spirit that must not be wasted. And Cato nodded before stepping back onto the dirt road, moving quickly into the woods on the other side, leaving behind the only stretch of land that had offered him shelter since his escape began. His journey north was long and brutal, as he walked for endless hours through forests, marshland, and narrow trails while avoiding patrols and hiding whenever he sensed danger. And several times he heard dogs in the distance and froze behind fallen logs, praying they would not pick up his scent. And twice he saw mounted men riding slowly down the road with rifles strapped to their backs, scanning the land for any sign of him. Days blended into nights as Cato pushed himself onward, surviving on the food he carried, while drinking from streams and sleeping beneath trees. And though exhaustion tried to drag him to the ground, he kept moving, because he knew the master would never forget the humiliation he felt, and would not rest until he believed Cato was dead. But Cato also carried something else within him, a new determination that had begun forming the moment he stepped through that broken fence, a determination that whispered that his escape was not only about survival, but about reclaiming the dignity stolen from him. And as he moved farther north, he began meeting people who opened hidden doors for him, former slaves who gave him shelter for a night, a group of traveling workers who warned him of routes to avoid, and even a preacher who offered him a worn Bible and a hot meal before sending him on his way. With each act of kindness, Cato felt a spark of hope growing inside him, because he realized he was no longer alone in the world. And as he approached the edge of the northern settlements, he finally saw the sight that made his knees weaken. A community of free men and women working together in open fields under the morning sun, without whips, without overseers, without fear. And when one of them approached and asked who he was, Cato answered that he was a man searching for a life where he would no longer be hunted for the way he looked or punished for things beyond his control. They welcomed him with cautious kindness and offered him a place to rest. And as weeks passed, Cato found work helping build homes, harvest crops, and assist new arrivals who escaped from the South, and he quickly became known for his strength, gentleness, and quiet determination. And soon he became part of a hidden network that guided other slaves who fled plantations, including men and women who had suffered under masters, just like the one who tried to destroy him. And Cato worked tirelessly to help them find safety, refusing to rest when someone needed guidance, refusing to forget the people who had helped him when he needed them most. Over time, Cato gained respect among the free community, not only for his bravery, but for his willingness to risk his own safety to help others. And though he never returned to his former plantation, he often prayed for the people still trapped there, including the slaves who had helped him escape, and even the oldest daughter who had risked everything to give him a chance at life. By the time he became a leader in the network of escape routes, he understood something powerful, that his survival was not an accident, but a responsibility. And he carried that responsibility with honor, helping one person after another move toward freedom until his name became known quietly among those who felt trapped in chains, spoken like a promise that hope could still breathe even in the darkest places. And so Cato, once the young man whose beauty nearly cost him his life, became something far greater than any master could have imagined, a quiet force of courage working behind the shadows, guiding forgotten souls toward the light of freedom. And though the memory of what he endured stayed with him forever, he refused to let bitterness consume him, because he believed his survival was meant to lift others rather than bury him in sorrow. Thank you for staying with us through this gripping tale of survival, strength, and the unpredictable twists of human hearts. And now we would love to hear from you. What have you learned from Cato's story? What lessons stand out to you? And where are you watching us from? Which city and which country do you call home? And if you have not yet subscribed to Voices from Forgotten Souls, now is the perfect time to do so, because your support helps us continue uncovering forgotten stories like this one. And if you would like to stand with us even further, please consider joining our membership platform, because your support, no matter how small, helps our team continue the difficult research required to bring you powerful stories from the past. And if you feel moved to send us a gift, our PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee links are available in our channel description page. And we want you to know that every gesture means more to us than words can express, and we never take your love and support for granted. So thank you for being part of this journey with us, and keep watching because more untold history is coming soon.